Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you joining us from all over the world at different times. And thank you for tuning in. I'm really incredibly honoured and excited to finally be hearing from a project that I have followed for many years, for work that I've been incredibly inspired by. And so I hope that you guys are going to enjoy this. Over the last couple of days, we've had so many different talks from leaders from a range of different backgrounds and cultures. And I know yesterday somebody asked, well, what does Indigenous social innovation look like in practice? And I think you heard me all say, well, if you're interested in that, come to this talk today, because the Winnipeg Boldness Project is certainly one of the most exciting and futuristic, innovative projects, and something that we could all learn from. And today we're going to be hearing a little bit from Diane Roussin. So I'm just going to introduce the session, the talk, Diane, and then I'm going to leave Diane to tell you a little bit more for a short while. So the title of today's session is Indigenous Social Innovation, Centering Indigenous Wisdom, Ways of Knowing, Being, Doing and Feeling. Centering Indigenous wisdom in social innovation work creates an opportunity to tap into community knowledge in order to improve the lives and future of not only Indigenous people, but all people and all our relations. Social transformation begins with the need for systems change. Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing and feeling lead the process of change through a social lab platform with the end goal of a dramatic shift in systems that is grounded in community. We're going to be exploring these concepts today with Diane, looking at the Winnipeg Boldness Project, a social innovation research and development project based in Point Douglas neighbourhood of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. The project uses tools and processes from the practice of social innovation to develop community-driven solutions to help children, families and communities to succeed and thrive. And today we're really excited and honoured to be joined by Diane Roussin, who's the project director of the Winnipeg Boldness Project. You can follow Diane on Twitter at Diane Roussin 007, which I think is a great Twitter handle. And their website is full of so much knowledge and work and examples and studies and possibilities. But for now, I'm going to say, welcome, Diane, to the festival. Welcome to the Department of Dreams. Thank you so much. And I'm going to leave you to talk to the audience for a while. I'll be back later, as we have been, for questions, so get them in because we've only got an hour session, so you need to make sure you get them in quickly. But for now, I'm going to leave you in the capable and inspiring hands of Diane. Thank you, Diane.
Well, thank you for that. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. And I think that how I would like to start this session is to do what has become a bit of a movement here in Canada and in Manitoba. We're one of the provinces in Canada. And it's to start with a land acknowledgement. And we do that so that we can honor and recognize and acknowledge the land that we're on and whose history that represents, and sort of how the people of this land have contributed to the formation of this province and the formation of this country, and how all the rest of us as citizens get to benefit from the land and the resources that are here, and the people that were taking care of the land and the resources before settlers came to Canada. And so right now I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and it is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dene, the Dakota, and it's also home of the Métis Nation. And there's a strong leadership of the Métis Nation here in Manitoba. And, one of a really well-known Métis leader is Louis Riel, and he had a very significant role to play in the creation of Manitoba and how Manitoba came to be a part of the country of Canada. And so we just want to always acknowledge, because up till now, history has not told that story. And so we're trying to bring that story forward. And so part of that is about Indigenous wisdom. It's, there have been Indigenous people on these lands for a long, long time. and they know these lands, and they've learned to be in relationship with these lands. And so again, the rest of Manitobans and Canadians have been able to benefit from that knowledge. In Winnipeg, we enjoy clean drinking water, and it's comes into our taps, and we can just turn the tap on and have as much water as we want. That water comes from a nation that's just an hour or so, or a couple hours away from Winnipeg, and it's the Shoal Lake 40 community. That's a First Nations community, an Indigenous community, and they're in an area that we call Treaty 3 area. And as well, 70% of the electricity that we enjoy here in Manitoba comes from it's hydroelectricity, so it comes from the water. And most of that water that's producing that electricity is in an area called Treaty 5 area. And so there's a few different nations who are a part of that. So again, it's just acknowledging that there are, that we get to, the rest of us as citizens get to enjoy the benefits from our Indigenous populations and lands. So the first image that you've got there is, there's a few objects there and a few sacred items, and those are what we know as medicines. And so we use a lot of medicines in our work, and they represent many different things, and we use them in a lot of different ways and at different times of the year and in different kinds of ceremonies, and they help us with a lot of different things. So again, when we talk about centering Indigenous wisdom, what does that mean? It means, also thinking about the medicines. But what is the Winnipeg Boldness Project most directly? It's a research and development project. It's focused in on a particular neighborhood in Winnipeg called the North Point Douglas neighborhood in Winnipeg. We're focused in on what we call, early childhood development. And so that's typically between the ages of 0 to 6 years of age. So we talk about what can we do to make it better for babies is the most basic question we're asking. And what our community tells us back is, babies don't live by themselves. Babies live in families, they live in communities, they live in neighborhoods, and they live with, a lot of things supporting them in order for babies to thrive and to do well. So when we look at what do we need to do to make it better for babies, we have to take all of that into account. And so we know that that's a very holistic approach. And I know holistic approaches to be very much Indigenous approaches. I know many other cultures have those approaches as well, but certainly Indigenous people have those approaches. And it also really operates from a place of understanding our interconnectedness and, ecosystems and how so many things are interrelated. And so, in Indigenous culture, we have a lot of teachings around interrelationship, reciprocity, mutuality, interconnectedness. Those are some very significant teachings. And you see a braid there of sweetgrass on that first slide. And again, that's teachings about interconnectedness and how when we braid ourselves together, how strong we are versus if you're sort of one strand of grass standing on your own. So we are a social innovation project. And so we are using tools of social innovation. And the particular tool we're using is a social lab. And we're using a social lab to figure out how we might address some complex challenges that our families are facing and that society is facing. And they're very interconnected. And so, these sort of single sort of one-shot solutions aren't that effective because we have to sort of be a bit more sophisticated in that. We talk about, and I think many of you may have heard the idea of a complex, wicked social problem. We're always thinking about that all the time at the Winnipeg Boldness Project, and because again, it just speaks to that very complex, the complex nature of these things that are facing our families. We started in 2014, and some of the data that we were looking at was saying that 60% of children were showing up to school not ready, and so that was sort of one of the presenting challenges that we started with. And when we started to look at why aren't kids why is that so? Like, why are kids showing up to school not ready? And really, that's where you start to surface this constellation of factors that are contributing to that situation. And so, how do you go about, like, where do you start? How do you go about, moving into this constellation? So for us, it was very clear to me that the very first place that we're going to start is in our neighborhood. We're going to go to our families, we're going to go to our community, and we're going to ask them. Like, that's always been my starting point. And so you see on this picture a number of our families and our children who are all, the particular images you're seeing right now are of parents and children that are driving this project. They meet on a regular basis. They're telling us what we need to know. They're giving us the direction. They're guiding us through, the emergence and the iteration. And they're just really providing the leadership of on this project about where we need to go and what we need to do to make it better for babies. So the next image is a picture of Glenn. And again, he's just one of our babies. He's a little bit bigger now. This picture is just a couple years old, but he lives in the neighborhood. And his parents are Shannon and Kevin, and Shannon and Kevin are very much, again, a part and have been a part of this project from the very start, and continue to be real drivers for our project. And I keep saying that, and it sounds so simple, but you wouldn't. It's really hard to believe that so many times with so many of these different resources and services that are geared towards our families, and they're supposed to be there to help our families and to help our families be better and do better, that a lot of those services and resources don't always have that effect. And at its worst, those resources and services are actually harming families. And part of the reason I feel that is the case is because no one really asks our families what they need or want. No one really asks our families, what do they think would be best, and how might we do this? And that's sort of sad, to think that there is some parts of our society who feel that our families don't really know what's best for them. That because they're in challenging situations, whether they're in poverty or whether their kids are in the care of CFS or whether they're, dealing with addictions or anything like that, that if they have those realities in their lives, that somehow they don't know what's best for themselves and their kids. Now, that isn't the only story for our families. Like, even if, folks are dealing with things like addiction, or their kids are in the care of child and family services, they have a lot of strengths still. And so it's drawing on those strengths, and it's focusing on their strengths to say, what can we do to further that strength and to make that, to make life better for you? Because we all know that you build strong communities from the assets and the strengths of communities. We don't normally build strong communities based on the deficits and the weaknesses of our communities. But we do that a lot with the services for our families. It's that we think families are full of deficits, so we design programs and services geared at targeting those deficits. And sometimes they become self-perpetuating, that if we're trying to, target this resource toward the deficit, well, now you have to have the deficit in order to access the resource. So it gets to be a bit of a spiral. So our research method is very much a strength-based approach. We very much think our families know. We think that they know what's working for them and what works for them. And we also know that it takes more than just our families to make that happen. And so I'll speak a little bit more about our collaborative approach. Like, it's going to take a lot of people working together to realize what our families are asking for. I think the difference here is that we center what the families are asking for versus centering, maybe what an outside expert is thinking. And because so many of our services and resources are based on an outside expert who probably has so much schooling and probably has a lot of research knowledge and, and can have a lot of that. Our families have experiential knowledge, and they have a PhD in experiential knowledge. And so that's the knowledge we're trying to center in this project. So this image is of what we now call our child-centered model. When we went into our neighborhood and we're asking our families, folks who are in the Point Douglas, what do you think it takes to make it better for babies? people were telling us, if you just do this, and if you just do that, and if you could just focus on this, and if you could do it in this way, we think that would make it better for babies. And so we knew that that way of doing it would lead to transformational change for our families in our neighborhood. So we busied ourselves in writing down, what is this way that families are telling us to this way of working? And that way of working has been in this neighborhood for generations. It didn't start with the Winnipeg Boldness Project. Winnipeg Boldness Project just is built upon that foundation. And I've been, prior to the Winnipeg Boldness Project, have been working in that neighborhood and in that way since I was a very young person. And so I've had the privilege of knowing this way and working in this way. And so have a real experience in this way. But I hadn't really written it down, and I hadn't really seen it written down in a lot of examples or in a lot of ways. So, talking to a lot of the leadership in the community, there was a strong message to, we need to write this way down. And so what you see here, this child-centered model, was a way of writing it down. And of course, you can link to our website, and we are on all the social media platforms, and you can read up on this way. We call it a number of different things. It has a few different ways of describing it because we have different audiences. Our community named this ways of knowing, being, doing, and feeling. And so that is very much, I see that a lot in Indigenous communities. I see that written down a lot, even on the internet, if you Google that. And it comes from a lot of Indigenous places, this ways of knowing, being, doing, and feeling. And so we originally called our model that. There were other audiences in Winnipeg that when we went to talk to them about that people didn't know what that meant, and that was very confusing to them as a title. So we went, oh, okay, it's a child-centered model, or and so it's and then ways of knowing, being, doing, and feeling. So we sort of had to translate it, and so people can sort of get their head around, oh, okay, I get it, a child-centered model. I sort of get what that might mean. So we've had to name it a couple things. In the social innovation world, social innovation often talks about a theory of change. So we then went back and started calling this our theory of change, because again, this model really is a high level. If you just pick out any one of those words in the Wordle there that you see, this model is a way of operating. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way. It's privileging a set of values and principles. So it's a lot of those kinds of things, and our families are saying, if you just work in this way with us, like if you center self-determination or strength-based approaches, or if you center identity, this is how we want to be worked with. And so when we do that, we get to that transformational change, which is what a theory of change is about. I believe it's that here's our theory that if you do things in this way, things are going to change in a good way. So that's our child-centered model. Because we're focused in on a particular neighborhood in Winnipeg, this neighborhood, the demographics and the characteristics of this neighborhood have a large Indigenous population and a large newcomer population. So there's a lot of different cultural groups in this neighborhood. And those are the families that are driving, our problem definitions. They're driving our solution building. And so that's how we ended up really focusing in on Indigenous knowledge as a way of leading this project. And so this is just an image of a medicine wheel. I myself am Anishinaabe. And so I know that medicine wheel teachings, come from a few different Indigenous cultures, but for sure they do come from Anishinaabe cultures. So, every part of the circle, there's so many teachings in medicine wheel teachings. For instance, ways of being, there's your physical being, your emotional being, your mental being, your spiritual being, and we can go on and on about, how we keep those things in balance. And when we know we got to figure out some physical, we got to pay attention to all those pieces, and we got to do things to physically keep ourselves healthy, to emotionally keep ourselves healthy, to mentally keep ourselves healthy, to spiritually keep ourselves healthy. The colors have many different teachings. These 4 colors here can represent the 4 nations across the globe. They can represent the directions like north, south, east, and west. They can represent the stages of life from birth to adolescence to adulthood to elder. And all of these pieces all work together. And so the circle and all these different teachings show how interconnected all these pieces are. So, so this is just another example of when we use this as a framework, and when we use this as our teaching tool, or when we base, say, our work plans even off of a model like this, that's how we're centering Indigenous wisdom. And so very much lots of different ways that we're centering the Indigenous wisdom. And the thing I'll say about Indigenous wisdom is very much about how do we do things for Indigenous people, because again, prior to settlers coming to Canada, there only were Indigenous people here. And so that's why a lot of our language, like Anishinaabe, sort of translates into the people, because at the time, like we were the only ones here. And so those ways of being were good for everybody that was here at the time. Now settlers have come since, and so we believe that those ways and approaches are good for all the settlers too. Like we think they're good for all human beings. And to go even further, when we look at medicine wheel teachings, one of the big teachings in it is about all my relations. So it's not, we don't even center humans. Humans are but one relation on this planet. Our trees, our water, our animals, our land, our mountains, like they are all our relations. Like, you know, we talk about grandmother moon, we talk about father sky, we talk about grandfathers and grandmothers, which are the rocks. You know, like we really privilege relationship and how we're in a relationship with all my relations, you know, on this earth. And so when you even view the world that way, it becomes about how do I live in a really good relationship with all my relations? How am I living in a good relationship with the water, with the land, with the trees, with the animals? If I don't think about being in a very good relationship with all my relations, then I might start thinking that I'm a little bit more dominant than the rest of them. Therefore, I have to control the water. I have to manage the water. I have to, you know, sort of put myself above the water and figure out how I might control. And so I think when we when we position ourselves with all my relations, it's just a different concept that we're more equal, and it's more about equity and again, being in relationship. Okay, so we are going to go to I guess community wisdom. So we feel that there is lots of research about early childhood development, and that research is around the world. It comes from many different cultures. There's lots written about it, and so you see an image there of all the books. So we know mainstream science has lots of wisdom about what's good for babies. We feel that what's missing is our community's perspective in terms of it's not written down as much. I think that knowledge sits in our people, it sits in our relationship, it sits in our ceremony, it sits in a lot of different places, but it might not be sitting in a written way as much as it is in those other places. So boldness is about trying to bring forward that community wisdom and tap into that community wisdom. And so that's the equity work of really focusing there and bringing it forward and using it to complement the mainstream science, and sometimes, most of the time, I do feel it complements and it interconnects. Sometimes it's contradictory. Sometimes, you know, the community wisdom says, yeah, no, that mainstream piece doesn't fit for us. Like, we don't feel that is the way that's best for our kids. And so we're seeing some of that too in our project. So social lab processes, maybe people on this session will maybe know a little bit about lab processes, but again, the basic piece is we're prototyping and then we're trying to figure out how to scale. So I really do feel like the prototyping process has been super conducive to the way we've been operating as Indigenous people anyway, to have a lot of space for emergence, to have a lot of space for risk and experimentation and trying and being able to be super responsive to what our families are saying. So we'll, you know, sort of do a quick design of something based on what our families are saying. Then we'll, you know, try to build that prototype based on that direction our families are giving us. Then we'll actually run families through the prototype. And then they'll further tell us that worked, that didn't work. So, you know, these rapid feedback loops, they'll say, nope, that was good. Nope, this was not good. We need more of that, or we missed this, or, you know, so they're always giving us the feedback about what works in our prototypes. So we just keep on iterating that prototype until we feel like we've got it right. Like our families are going, this is it. And the language we use a lot in Boldness is, this is the Cadillac. You know, we're so used to getting the broke down jalopy and having to make do with a broke down jalopy. When we design that prototype the way our families are telling us full on, it's a Cadillac. And so when our families are experiencing that prototype, they're like, this is what we want. And some of the drawback on that is when families experience a really great prototype, they want more of it. So they want scaling, right? That's not the language our families use, but that's what they want. And so when we end the prototyping phase, our families feel a loss, and our families are like, why did we end that? Like, that was a good thing. We need to. So then sometimes it's like, oh, somebody pulled the funding, or Boldness, you know, stopped running that program or that resource, and we really loved it. So sometimes we get a little bit of blowback on that, but it's blowback I'll take, because I'm like, I know you want that, and I know you want more of it. And that just makes me more committed to trying to find partners and to figure out ways to scale this Cadillac, because I know that this is what families want and need. And you see their disappointment when it stops. So I just take that as, okay, we just got to push harder to make this happen. So that's the labbing piece. So, you know, this is just an image to show you that we have, we're up to about 12 prototypes now. All of the prototypes connect to each other. And so sometimes we have to arbitrarily just put some borders around it, just so that people can get their heads around it. And so sometimes we're arbitrarily putting it in this circle or that circle, just to put it somewhere and to start to put some description to it. But all of our prototypes are very interconnected. There's a lot of mutuality in it. You know, the driving values and principles are similar throughout all the prototypes. So sometimes they feel very similar. But this is just a visual to try to show you that all of our prototypes are very interconnected. And sometimes when I step back, I can see it as one massive prototype with all these different mini prototypes within it, is another way that we could look at that. So one of the prototypes I thought I would focus on, because I think this one for me clearly demonstrated how the community wisdom surfaces and how it tells us, here's how we want this to be, versus a program or service or resource that has been developed without them. And so it's been developed somewhere else. And this happens all the time in Winnipeg, happens all the time in Manitoba, and I'm pretty sure it happens all the time in Canada, that, again, either something worked somewhere else really well, and so we try to bring it here, but we don't involve families in that process. And so we don't ask our families if we think this is going to work with them. We just think because it worked with people over there, it's going to work here. It's not always the case. Or again, I go to this expert thing. Sometimes, you know, paid experts design things, and I don't know how often they're involving actual people or participants in their design. And so when they come here, they just don't work at all for our families, and our families actually have a visceral negative reaction to some of these things. So we were experiencing, and we have an infant mortality issue here in Winnipeg. And so clearly in the hospitals, you know, doctors and nurses and the folks that are tending to babies that are showing up at the hospital, like, this is a serious issue and we need to do something about it. And so there was a lot of energy being put into, okay, we got to deal with this infant mortality issues. And we agree, like, we need to, like, that is such a pressing issue. So we agree, it's a super pressing issue. So what are we going to do about it? And so there was this idea that maybe we could use this concept of baby box, because the baby box had been developed, like, I want to say a long time ago, and it developed, you know, it's a Finnish baby box. And so, and I think way back in that day, they were trying to deal with the infant mortality issue. And so this was the solution for it, and it worked for them. And it had, you know, it's had an impact on their infant mortality rates over time. And so we can see some of that documentation. So there was a move to potentially use that same approach here in Winnipeg. And so we kind of stepped up and said, well, hey, let's go to our community wisdom. Let's go to our families. Let's go see what they think about this and what they think about the infant mortality issue and what kind of, is this what they would do? And can we, can it go as is, or should we iterate some more, or should we, make some adjustments to the baby box, or what does our community even think? And in the end, I mean, it was a big, long process to get here, but in the end, our community said, no, we don't think we are into the baby box, and here's why. And so right away, the baby box, it's an actual box, and it's addressing safe sleep surfaces. And so you can have your baby sleep in this box, and that's how we keep our babies alive, right? Because infant mortality, I guess there was some parallel being drawn between infant mortality and shared beds with families. So our community right away said, why are we talking about keeping the babies alive? That is a pretty low bar. We feel that we should be talking about babies thriving, so thrive versus alive. And so that sets the bar way higher than just keep the babies alive. And so so that's where our community wanted to start the conversation. And so we went, okay, let's go there. What does it take to have babies thrive? And so right away, it became apparent that the baby box approach here in Canada was very transactional. You go to a website, you can sign up, you can get it delivered to your door. It's very transactional. Just drop down box, click, delivery, shows up at your door, box arrives, then use box. Whereas our community was saying, nope, that's not good enough. We feel that this tool needs to foster strong relationships and interconnections. So not order off online and just have it dropped off at door. We want to be in relationship with each other. And when there's a new baby coming around, we want a strong set of supportive and healthy relationships around baby and around family. So we need a tool that's going to foster strong relationships and interconnections. So our community said, let's do basket instead of box. And it's the idea of somebody bringing a basket to the house or to baby and to family. And what's in the basket, there is some elements of what's in basket. So that's great. And in the baby box, the box itself, and there's in some iterations of it, there's some content in those boxes. It's a very standardized approach. Everybody gets the exact same thing in those boxes. Our community was saying, we need customization, we need uniqueness, so in the basket, people can have a choice of what they want. So our prototype was about, there was sort of this laundry list of things that, and each was assigned points. And so our family could pick and choose what they needed up to a point system. And so and of course, like some people are having their third child, some people are having their first child, some people are, so some people need very different things. And of course, recognizing poverty, our families were saying, we can access sort of the easy, cheap stuff. Like we get that all over the place. It's the harder things like car seats and strollers and double strollers. It's the higher end items that we need help with. And so that surfaced in our prototyping too. So poverty surfaces, right? But again, and we see this in almost all of our prototypes. These same principles are surfacing in all of our prototypes. Our families are asking for customized approaches, not standardized approaches. And when we do customized approaches, it really brings forward concepts of equity, working with equitable approaches versus equal approaches, because equal sort of implies everybody gets the same thing, which is sort of that universal kind of approach. But not everybody's starting from the same place, or not everybody's in the same place. So the universal equal thing doesn't always work for our families. Our families are asking for more targeted and unique and customized approaches. And I can go on, but that prototype for me really surfaces a lot of the learning in our lab. And when community wisdom is centered, what happens and what our community starts to tell us. So here's some beautiful faces of a lot of the people that have been involved in our project. Again, when our community says, for instance, baby basket, so we went through a whole prototyping process. We had, and then there was the, under baby box, to punch those things out for X amount of dollars, like the economy of scale, you know, it became about an efficiency of how much per box and how many can we get out, you know, for the cheapest amount of money. And our community said, we want our local women, we have a local community development, economic development group here who runs a shop. It's sort of a secondhand shop kind of a thing. But that shop is run by one of our women's centers, and it employs local and it creates jobs. And so really using that community economic development approach in how we produce the baby baskets was better for our community, and said this needs to create local jobs, and we need our local women to be doing it, and it just all needs to be very local. Whereas Baby Box, I think, you know, there was maybe some corporate company in the States that was making them, and, you know, and was, again, so our group just said, that's not the approach we want to take. So, which is a segue into this next piece, which is when our community says that this is the solution they'd really like to see happen, it takes a lot of moving parts to make that happen as a prototype. It also takes a lot of moving parts to then scale that. And so we need a lot of stakeholders and supporters and partners to make the scaling happen. And so those partners can be government, philanthropic groups, you know, corporations, government. I think I said government already. All of our other not-for-profits, like lots of our other not-for-profit organizations might want to do it as well. So we're always really working hard at developing relationships again to support the collaboration that's required for scaling prototyping. So this is just a little visual we use with all the little dots, where the first dot might have started, you know, in the north end of Winnipeg, and then that dot has in one of our prototypes sort of scaled across the country in a few different ways. So again, when you're labbing, a big piece of labbing, or an underlying element of social labbing, is that there has to be a cross-sectoral collaborative approach in your work, as well as a focus on systemic change, that we need systems to change. So that's what I love about labbing as well. So, so I'm sort of wrapping up here, and I like to end on this a little bit, because in social innovation world, we talk a lot about being innovative and doing things differently, and so we're always saying, like, well, what does that look like, and what does that mean? And so with this concept of thinking outside the box, you know, we hear that a lot, and part of me has always reacted to that to say, well, when I think outside the box, I still sort of am thinking box, or I'm still, like, the box is still my core framework if I'm trying to think outside of it. What feels more resonant for me is when we're thinking inside the circle. Because when I think inside the circle, or when I'm thinking in the circle, I don't at all think about boxes. And it just takes me in a whole different place. And so for me, thinking inside the circle very much is about centering Indigenous wisdom. So I think that's probably maybe where I want to leave it. Here's all of our contact information. But yeah, I think maybe a question that I might have for folks, I mean, there's lots of different questions, but it's how might you think inside the circle? How might we use different approaches in the work that we're doing? So yeah, that's me.
Diane, wow, thank you so much. It's so good to hear you talk through the story. I think I've and the things that you're learning and the way that you're trying to work, because I've seen the work so far through the lens of the prototypes, and as opposed to hearing like what's led to it. And I can see in the comments as well, people talking about the transactional versus relational approach, the fighting this urge to scale in an impersonal and non-relational way. And you know, in a couple of groups I'm in, people are commenting on the talk as well. And I think that what I really loved about the talk was just the moment where you took us back to the baby basket slide, because I think when so we've talked a lot over the last few days about embodied knowledge knowledge that sits within communities and how you bring that out. And I think there's a lot of examples of, you know, what we need to do, especially sort of in England and the UK, around the first 1,000 days of baby's life and all of the theory. And of course, it's really important, as you said, right? There's loads of overlaps and there's lots and lots of important. But what the baby basket example just shows so clearly and simply, in a way, is that it was centering that community, it was centering the parents, centering the families, and it was just tiny, gentle, sincere, Jill's just said, delicate shifts in, no, let's not do this, let's do this, let's change the language, let's change how the process happens, and I'm just fascinated by that. The one prototype that really drew me was the Indigenous doula prototype, and I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about that as well. But I'm going to bring some questions in from the audience. So first of all, can I just say huge thank you for just the way you took us through that, because I know it's quite profound and for lots of people, and you can kind of see it in the chat. So yeah, thank you and gratitude for that. And let's go to so 2 questions. You can answer them however you'd like to. I'd love just to very selfishly hear a bit more about the Indigenous doula prototype, and as you said, they're all interconnected, so I can imagine that there's lots of crossovers. But also Jill says, wow, this process is so delicate and sincere. Thank you for sharing this. How do you keep listening at the center of things? And this is really interesting for me because I came across you through the kind of Canadian not-for-profit world, like the foundations, and I think Jane Engel shared your project. And what I'm really interested in is I'm sure you're still running a project with jobs and offices and cash flow and needing to get resources into these prototypes. And I'm actually interested in really truly, how do you keep these delicate, sincere, beautiful processes at the heart of the work and not just get co-opted by like philanthropy and the system and all of that? And I was wondering if you could speak to some of those, just you know, what you think.
I would say that my whole career, and maybe my life even, but my whole career very much has been about working with families and working in that way that was the ways of knowing, being, doing, and feeling. So really having a good understanding of relationship is the center. So how are we in good relationship? And so you'll see on some of my social media, I was saying pursuit of Mino Bamadzawin. And in Anishinaabe, that means the good life, right? And so it's about being in balance and interconnected. And so this relationship is at center, and we're always wanting to be in super good relationship with our community. So that's how we keep it centered on what's real and what works for families, we set up structures to be in super good relationship with our families. And we have lots of different circles where we do that. And, you know, one of our philanthropist partners talks about us being polycentric, having polycentric governance, you know, so that's one of the ways that we keep it super sensitive and real. Funding wise, this is where I will give credit to the structure of a social lab, because the lab allows our funders to put their money on the table for labbing. And so when you do the prototyping process, you are allowed then to be in this blank slate place. You're allowed to like have the space for, you know, and the community is now talking about social R&D. Corporate community knows about R&D and spends significant amounts of its budget in R&D to develop phones and cars and everything else, right? So there's a lot of effort and resourcing that goes into the design and development of new product that's going to really meet the needs. We don't do that in social services world, at least not in Winnipeg, not that I see. I've been kicking around in social service world for a long time. We don't do social R&D. So the lab very much is social R&D, and it's a specific, deliberate space for it. I feel that a lot of us were doing this before Boldness came along. We were doing it off the side of our desk. So we were doing it when we can get to it. We were trying to do it as much as we could in our work, but we're not really funded to do it that way. And the funding structures aren't really set up to do it that way. So then often you're doing under cover of darkness. If you're trying to really meet the needs of community, sometimes a lot of the times our funding structures aren't set up that way. So when we're trying to make it work for community, sometimes I'm telling you, and I know this is going to be broadcast, so I'd be careful what I say, but sometimes we're breaking rules. We're doing stuff and we're not telling people we're doing it. You know, we're like quietly over here and quietly over there. And we do that with the risk that if we get caught, we're going to be called mismanagers. We're going to be called corrupt. We're going to be accused of, doing not right things with your money. And that's death in the not-for-profit world, because you're being entrusted with a lot of resources, right? So boldness allowed us to operate in the light. It allowed us to do it in the light, full on, with our families, and then show that to everybody who wanted to listen and say, this is how our families want it. And when we're allowed to do X, Y, Z, this is what happens.
That's such an important point, just that shift in language and opening up that space to be able to, not be accused in where Western knowledge is centered in everything, and not being accused of, like you said, mismanaging and other things, when actually that work is really the work that needs to be acknowledged, but it's not, and centered, but it's just not the dominant narrative. We've got a question coming in from Josie, which I think this is a really great one, because we had a conversation previously as well about this, and another Indigenous leader yesterday talked about this, who's from America, Florida, and she was talking about how Indigenous knowledge is acknowledged. So the question from Josie is, I've noticed more discussion of Indigenous knowledges within social and environmental circles in Europe. Do you know how your community would like to see their knowledge being acknowledged and listened to respectfully at a global scale?
That's a very deep question with a deep answer. The first thing I'd say is that there are multiple knowledges. So knowing that there's a multiplicity, so there's not ever just the one generic answer. And to me, you'll never go wrong when you're in a really deep, good relationship with whoever. So when you're in a really good relationship with whichever Indigenous community you're working with, they will guide you about it, to answer that question, so it can be very specific. I know here in our neighborhood, for instance, that baby basket concept we were just talking about, our community actually was taking it further and wanted to call it baby bundle. Now, that is a whole ceremonial spiritual practice around bundles for Indigenous cultures. But our community said, we're not ready for that yet. We're not ready to put that out there yet, because we feel that if we put that out there, people may just run with that, and then it runs the risk of appropriation, and it runs the risk of not using the tools and the teachings properly. And we feel that's super important. So they pulled it back and said, no, we're just going to say bundle for now. And when the time is right, we will move to, we're going to use basket for now. And when the time is right, we will then move closer to the concept of bundle. But right now, we're too leery about it. So that was a way that we went, okay, then we're going to call it bundle for now, so that we can all put it on the internet. You can all look at it. But if you really want to employ this approach called bundle, it is so relationship based. It's not just to look at the website and then just implement. They were very specific about that. So that is, again, when you're in strong relationship, people will guide and tell you how and when they want stuff. And I'm telling you, it's a very complex discussion. I know in Canada, we're in the era of truth and reconciliation, and there's a fine line between, recognition and indigenizing and holding up Indigenous ways, and appropriation, And so we're always super careful. And again, for me, it's really centered in relationship to know, when am I being appropriate and when am I appropriating?
Thank you. That's so important. Really, really grateful for that wisdom. And does that mean that you sometimes find yourself, I'm trying to think how to word this. This is more of a personal question. So if we look at how mainstream capitalism, companies, even the social innovation sector works, it's like fast, big problems. We need to move quickly. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need to, you can imagine the amount of different, you've probably seen it and experienced it a lot as well in the sector in Canada. Does that mean you sometimes are working much slower than that? Is that something that's already steeped in the culture that you're from? Like how does that play out? Do you just know that you're just moving at the pace of the trust within your own community? And how do you balance that with how the sector works and how the country and the economy and everything else works?
I believe in the speed of relationships. You've probably all heard about that or get that concept. And so Boldness is into our 7th year. But it is built on a foundation of relationships that have been around for like generations. And so I, again, have had the privilege of being in those relationships. So I was able to bring that into this project. So we're talking generations of relationship building. So strong, trusting, deep relationships. When those foundations are built, we can turn on a dime and move in a second. And so with the example I give, not this particular mayor of Winnipeg, it was the previous mayor of Winnipeg, but something had happened and I got all annoyed about it. I mean, I've had my days where I, led the mob down to City Hall, to beat up a politician. Like I've done that. And I don't, I have a different tact now, but at that time, I was reading the front page of the newspaper, me and another leader of an organization. And we were reading this and we couldn't believe ourselves. Like we were like, what is this mayor doing? Like, oh my gosh. And we got so annoyed and so mad. And so we said, we're going down there. And so within a week, we had a mob of like 50 people down there. And those people are the busiest people on the planet. Like you cannot get into their schedules without a 3-week notice. Like people are super busy based off a very minimal email that went out to all those people, like very minimal email was just, we got to go. We need to do this. Show up here. Be ready for that. And people showed up without question. And so like to organize that quickly, that's the speed of trust. And that's the speed of relationships. So yeah, it's just where are we going to take the time? You're going to take the time on the front end developing a relationship, which means you're going to be able to move real fast. So I see this in the community all the time. We can deal with complexity and we can go deep into complexity fast. And we can solve stuff fast because we've spent the time in that deep relationship building. My experience has been when the relationship is an inch deep, gosh, we can like meet for a year and get nowhere if we're not spending the time to develop relationship.
Thank you so much. So many gems here. I mean, I'm furiously like scribbling down. We've got time for maybe, I'm going to just go for one more question, even though we're about to squeeze over time. Can you expand on being appropriate and when I'm appropriating? I think you've probably answered that in the relationship, right? Like the deeper the relationship, the more you're aware of that. And what you said about that, where are you going to take the time at the beginning when you can build the foundations or at the end when it's all gone wrong? And I think that's so useful because there's so many examples I can draw on where things have gone really well and I'm trying to figure out why and when they've gone catastrophically wrong and there's just a breakdown in trust.
I always give around that because I think we've all probably experienced this, human relationships, right? Like you've probably all been sort of in a partnered romantic kind of a relationship. And when that relationship is really, really good, you give each other lots of space and there's lots of patience and, you can say the dumbest thing and they're like, they'll be there to support you. When that relationship is bad, you can just sort of look at someone sideways and they'll just go off going, why did you look at me like that? And you're like, I didn't look at you. That's the example, right? Like because there's in complexity, there's a lot of tension. There can be a lot of challenging. There can be a lot of contention. And so when the relationship's good, you can work through that tough stuff in a good way. When the relationship's not great, it is so hard.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, we'll take this last question and then we'll start to wrap up. Janine asks, can you unpack more the centering of innovation from inside the circle in contrast to thinking outside of the box with maybe some more examples of practice? And maybe this can just lean into, could you just maybe give an example of another prototype, just because you've got so many good ones, and maybe we can have that as a last question.
Well, I think leaning inside the circle for me, it means leaning into Indigenous wisdom, like centering Indigenous wisdom. And when I think outside the box, I don't think I'm centering Indigenous wisdom. So that's sort of where I start. When I lean into Indigenous wisdom, I'm like, okay, well, what are the Indigenous practices? So you talked about the doulas. For instance, if you can imagine, I have 2 children, 2 daughters, and I had my children in a hospital. And so I was, and I know I had other choices, but I just happened to have my children in the hospital. I was on my back with my feet up in stirrups and, you know, I had a doctor and a nurse, and the nurses were great. I was allowed 2 people. So I had, and I actually wanted 4 because I wanted more people around me, but they only allow so many. And so, you know, and then the doctor, brought my baby into the world, or the nurse probably did lots of it. And then the doctor, you know, did the last part. The Indigenous doulas have a dream. They see a community center that's big enough for the whole community to be in. They've done this. They sort of have these centers do exist, and so, but there was this. They did a mock thing of how this would look. They had the woman who was giving birth in the middle of the room. She was surrounded by a group of birth workers and helpers, like a bunch of other, mostly women. And then there was just these concentric circles all the way around. So there was this whole community in the room bringing this baby into the world, singing the language, how their feet first touch the ground. There's just so many different ways we can bring babies into the world. So that is a centering of Indigenous wisdom about how we bring children into the world, versus the more sort of sterile, which felt kind of transactional, which felt different.
What a beautiful way to start wrapping up this session. The dreams of Indigenous doulas, given that we're in the Department of Dreams. This was really beautiful. I mean, to be honest, I kept thinking, I think I can just leave Diane to talk, and I just don't want to interrupt because there's so much beautiful wisdom there. There's some really lovely comments in the chat. And Diane, I would like to say, before I let you sort of say the final words, I'd like to say thank you so much. There's so much you've shared in a short period of time, so generously, and we really appreciate it, and we're really thankful for the work that you're doing, because we're not in the greatest place over here right now, in the UK, and particularly in England, and so many of us are like trying to fight for something else. I want to say, in difficult times for everybody, we didn't even really get into how Point Douglas has been dealing with COVID-19 and all of that. I mean, we could have had a whole conversation there, but I'm pretty sure that the families that you're working with are in great hands, and you're going to be way ahead of the game because of the way you're working together. We certainly heard that yesterday morning when we were talking to Angie Tengere, who's based in New Zealand, and talked about how her community, using the cultural and Indigenous wisdom, was organising around COVID, and was already in the maintenance and recovery phase, whilst so many other places are in crisis. But what I was going to say was that we're really grateful, because it's a difficult time for lots of people in the UK, particularly England. You know, there's a real lack of leadership, and there's a lot of fear around what's happening. And hearing you talk about centering families, starting with the questions of thriving and children and what's best for the babies, centering cultural knowledge and embodied knowledge, and working together in deep relationship has really, really stood out for me. And there's so many beautiful comments for you on the side. I just wanted to leave the last word with you, really. If you wanted to share anything or anything with the audience, we'd be really grateful.
Well, again, and trying to be true to the values of relationship, we're always happy to engage. So I do want to say thank you for inviting us and for reaching out. I know, Amandeep, there were some tough times for you too, and you stayed with it and you stayed on it. And so I know Boldness wouldn't be part of this unless if it wasn't for your persistence and tenacity. So miigwech, thank you. And we're always happy to share. So if people want to reach out and want to learn more, we're always happy to take the time, because we feel that that's part of it, right? Yes, go to the website, look at all the stuff and do all that. We try to put it up there too. But we get that there's probably more learning when we engage. And so we're happy to do that.